He was found frozen in his tent. His hands were clutching a pole. He had tried to hold the shelter against the wind to his last breath. 2 others were sitting on the slope, trying to hide from the hurricane. The other 4 vanished without a trace. July 1967, Denali. 7 people died in a single night. But let's start from the beginning. Denali is the highest point in North America, 6,190 meters above sea level. In 2025, President Trump restored the mountain's old name, McKinley. In the language of the Athabascan tribe, Denali means the Great One. Indigenous peoples considered this peak sacred and forbidden territory. However, this did not stop the pioneers. On June 7, 1913, an expedition led by Hudson Stuck reached the peak. Stuck named the mountain McKinley. Then, in 2015, the name Denali was restored. And recently, it was renamed McKinley again. A real back and forth with the names. Technically, the ascent of Denali is not considered exceedingly difficult. But there's a catch. The vertical relief creates one of the longest base-to-summit routes in the world. It is almost 1,800 meters longer than Everest's. By 1967, 213 people had reached the peak. However, only half of the attempts were successful. Half turned back without reaching the top, or didn't return at all. Why is that? It's about location. Denali stands on the 63rd parallel north. For comparison, Everest is on the 28th. The higher the latitude, the more aggressively and rapidly storm systems move. Plus, the temperatures there are significantly lower. It can be cold on Everest, but the cold on Denali is different. A northern, vicious cold that chills you to the bone, even through all layers of clothing. But the main difference lies elsewhere. Everest is located in the center of the Asian continent, more than 1,500 kilometers from large bodies of water. Denali, however, is separated from the Gulf of Alaska by only 320 kilometers. The mountain takes the brunt of powerful, low-pressure systems, some of the most intense on the planet. Simply put, the weather on Denali is a catastrophe. Its geographical location turns the peak into a storm factory. When marine winds hit the slopes, moist air masses rise, condense into clouds, and unleash snow. A typical snowfall here can bring up to 30 centimeters. All this is accompanied by hurricanes, some of the most violent on Earth. The wind drops the temperature to extreme values in a matter of minutes. You could be standing in -10, and half an hour later, the thermometer will show -40. And that's without the wind chill. With it, it feels like 60 below. And yet, Denali remains an incredibly popular goal. Conquering this summit is a serious achievement in a mountaineering career. It beckons. The altitude is not extreme. Technically, it's not Everest, but its character is harsh. Now for the story itself. In 1967, 2 young climbers, Paul Schlichter and Howard Snyder, planned an expedition to Denali. The guys were only 22, but they already had experience. They met in 1963 and spent 4 years honing their skills in Colorado, on Mount Rainier, in Wyoming, and on Mexico's Orizaba, which is 5,891 meters high. In short, they were not novices. They knew what altitude was, how a rope works, and how to distribute the load on a rope team. In June, Schlichter completed his training at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Snyder, more open and sociable, was pursuing a degree in geography at the University of Colorado. Charismatic, with a natural charm, he was the informal leader of their team. He was the one who made decisions, the one whose opinion was respected. Initially, Schlichter and Snyder planned the expedition with their Colorado group of 4, themselves plus Jerry Lewis, a 30-year-old Army veteran, and his younger brother Steve. But 7 hours before their flight to Alaska, Steve was in a car accident, breaking his nose and an arm. The group was down to 3, just hours before the start. The problem was that the National Park Service prohibited ascents by groups of fewer than 4 people. The rule was strict, no exceptions. The only way out was to join another team. So the 3 from Colorado merged with Joe Wilcox's 9-person expedition. The Park Service's plan was simple. Wilcox's group was also not permitted to climb. The members lacked sufficient experience. But if the experienced guys from Colorado were combined with Wilcox's novices, it would create a full-fledged team capable of handling the task. At least, that's how it looked on paper. However, there was a snag. The men didn't know each other at all. Moreover, even within Wilcox's group, many were meeting for the first time. Essentially, they were students from different institutions, thrown together and asked, "Want to climb Denali?" They answered, "We do." They were told, "Go. Here are 3 more experienced guys. You'll manage." There was no cohesion, no understanding of how each person behaved under pressure. Who was strong, who was weak, who panicked, who held it together. None of that existed. The expedition was led by Joe Wilcox, a 24-year-old graduate student. The plan was to ascend Denali via the Muldrow Glacier on the north face, a more remote and cheaper route compared to the popular West Buttress. Fewer people, lower costs, but also more difficult. Except the organization of this venture was severely lacking. As mentioned, Wilcox's expedition was initially denied a permit due to the members' lack of experience. But the addition of the experienced climbers from Colorado suddenly solved the problem in the eyes of the Park Service. The participants' ages ranged from 22 to 31, young men. A diverse group, mostly strangers to one another. And most importantly, other than Schlichter and Lewis, no one had experienced climbing above 4,500 meters, and Denali is over 6,000. In fact, the participants' level of preparation varied radically. Additionally, conflicts constantly flared up within the team. Some members were not even on speaking terms. The tension was palpable even before they started. And with this baggage, they set off for the mountain. The climbers began their ascent on June 22nd. The expedition moved from the north along the Karstens Ridge route via the Muldrow Glacier. Most of the men suffered from altitude sickness, but progress was decent. Heads were splitting, nausea set in, and they were short of breath even standing still. But they kept going. By July 13, they had set up camp at an altitude of 4,600 meters. Here, you truly feel the altitude. The air is thin. Every breath is an effort. At night, you wake up because you've forgotten to breathe. The body hasn't yet adapted. At this point, according to some reports, Park Service rangers contacted the team and warned them of an approaching, powerful storm expected to hit the mountain on July 16 or 17. However, Wilcox later claimed they received no such warning. The dispute was never resolved. The next day, 8 members of the team climbed higher to establish a final camp at 5,500 meters. The plan was to head for the summit on the morning of the 15th to hit the weather window, to make it before the storm. But something stupid happened. A faulty stove exploded in a tent and started a fire. The fire flared up suddenly, and they had to extinguish it quickly and check their gear. The ascent had to be postponed. They lost precious hours. They only set out for the summit push at noon on July 15th. The first group consisted of Wilcox, Snyder, Lewis, and Schlichter, effectively the strongest climbers on the team, the ones who would definitely make it. They later explained that the others needed rest and were suffering from altitude sickness, so they postponed their ascent to the next day. Though one could also assume something else. The experienced climbers simply wanted to bag the summit quickly, rather than fussing over the sick and the novices who were in the high mountains for the first time. And upon descending, they might have planned to talk the others out of the ascent, now that their own goals were achieved. It makes sense. Why risk it? In any case, on July 15, 1967, four 22-year-old climbers were patting each other on the back on the summit of Denali, enjoying the views from the highest point in North America. The ascent was easy, without incident. Wilcox, Snyder, Lewis, and Schlichter stood on the summit. Their two rope teams were the first. The others were supposed to follow their broken trail. The weather was perfect, sunny. The temperature was plus 15 degrees Celsius, almost no wind. Visibility for dozens of kilometers. The snow sparkled underfoot. Moments like these are remembered forever. You stand above everyone around you. The sky is close, and it feels like the world belongs to you. After enjoying the views, an hour and a half after reaching the peak, the foursome began their descent. They crossed the summit ridge, which drops 2,600 meters to the glacier, past Archdeacon's Tower, a small sub-peak at 5,900 meters, and continued toward Denali Pass. Here, they noticed the wind was starting to pick up, faintly at first, then more persistently. Their hoods began to flap. The snow underfoot crunched differently, drier, angrier. Meanwhile, the other 8 members were preparing for their own summit push after a day of rest. Above them, the sky was streaked with cirrus clouds, an ominous sign of an approaching storm. Those who know mountains always read the sky. Cirrus clouds are the first warning. About 2 hours after summiting, Schlichter, Snyder, Wilcox, and Lewis returned to the camp at 5,690 meters. There, they found their 8 comrades preparing for the ascent. The second group planned to set out the next day, July 16th. There's nothing surprising about Schlichter and Snyder reaching the summit with the first group. They were the strongest climbers on the team, the ones who moved confidently, without gasping for breath, without stopping every 10 steps. The other members of Wilcox's expedition had almost no high-altitude experience, were in poor physical condition, and suffered from altitude sickness. Their heads were splitting, they were short of breath, their legs felt like lead. However, Wilcox, as the leader, did not dissuade them from the ascent. Moreover, the strongest members, Wilcox, Lewis, Snyder, and Schlichter, had already been to the summit. This meant no one would go with the second group of poorly prepared people. The novices would be left to their own devices, without the safety of the experienced climbers. That night, a hurricane hit the camp. Wind speeds reached 112 kilometers per hour, plus heavy snowfall. The tents howled, the poles bent, and the fabric flapped so loudly it was impossible to sleep. But the group weathered the storm in their tents. Waking up on the morning of the 17th, they saw that the wind was still strong and the peaks were hidden by clouds. But gradually, the situation began to improve. The clouds crept higher, the wind subsided. By 1 in the afternoon, it was sunny and almost cloudless. It seemed the storm had passed them by. The 4 men who had already been to the summit prepared to descend to the camp at 4,570 meters. They expected the others to set out for the summit 10-15 minutes after they left. It was logical to follow the fresh tracks on the broken trail. Anshel Schiff, a 30-year-old college professor from Indiana, was struggling with altitude sickness. His head was splitting. He was nauseous, and his coordination was off. At the last moment, he decided to give up on the summit and descend with Snyder and Schlichter's group. A wise decision. The altitude does not forgive weakness. As the 5 of them descended to the lower camp, they had a clear view of the camp at 5,400 meters. They were surprised to see that the second group had not yet started its summit push. Instead, the climbers were milling about the camp, rearranging their packs, talking, and digging things out from under the snow. An incomprehensible fuss. The weather was good, yet they were wasting time. "On Denali, you don't waste good weather," Schlichter lettered. He knew what he was talking about. The window could close at any moment. Their group continued its descent. The second group, led by Jerry Clark, a 30-year-old electrical engineer and member of Antarctic expeditions, finally set out for the summit around 3 in the afternoon. Too late. It was already too late, but they didn't realize it yet. 23-year-old college graduate Steve Taylor, who was suffering from altitude sickness, decided to stay in camp. Only 6 went for the summit. About 5 hours later, at 8:30 p.m., Clark made radio contact with the rangers at the Eielson Visitor Center. His voice on the radio sounded strained. He reported that they were high on the mountain and didn't know which way to go. A thick fog had rolled in. The team couldn't see the path to the summit. Visibility dropped to 0, a whiteout. The group decided to spend the night without tents, to make a cold bivouac, hoping the weather would clear by morning. Since they had planned a quick ascent, they had little food, a few sleeping bags, and not a single tent. They had counted on going up and down in a day. A cold bivouac at over 6,000 meters is an ordeal. You sit, huddled against a companion, trying to conserve heat. Shivers rack you through all your layers of clothing. Your fingers go numb. The main thing is not to fall asleep. Sleep at such an altitude in the cold means death. At 11:30 a.m. on July 18th, Clark contacted the rangers again. His voice sounded tired but relieved. He reported that the team had reached the summit. They were standing on Denali. They had made it. He said the air temperature was -7 degrees. A strong wind was blowing. They were in a blizzard and planned to descend in 5-10 minutes, a quick descent while they still had strength. The team also reported that only 5 had reached the summit. They were Dennis Luchterhand, Hank James, Mark McClellan, Walt Taylor, and Clark. The fate of the 6th, John Russell, was unknown. Perhaps he had turned back earlier. They ended the radio session, promising to make contact again at 8 that evening. But the next signal never came. The radio was silent. After the team reached the summit on July 18th, one of the most violent storms in history descended on Denali. According to the National Weather Service, wind gusts on the summit intensified to 160 kilometers per hour. They eventually reached 480 kilometers per hour. 480. That's the speed of a tornado. A wind like that knocks a person off their feet, rips a backpack off, and blows gloves away in a second. The temperature plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. With the wind chill, it felt like -70. Survival is impossible in such conditions. You can't stand. You can't move. The wind knocks the breath out of you, tearing the air from your lungs. Snow pelts your face like sand from a sandblaster. Visibility is zero. You can't see your own hands. On the morning of July 20, Wilcox, Snyder, and Schlichter tried to return to the high camp to find the missing men. But they were forced back by the bad weather. The wind wouldn't let them pass. There was no sign of the missing climbers, only a white wall. The expedition leader then reported the incident to the National Park Service, but rescuers couldn't begin an operation while the storm raged. Helicopters don't fly in such weather. People don't go out. The bad weather continued for another 2 days. During this time, the 5 men at 4,570 meters found themselves in danger. They abandoned one tent and all crammed into a 3-person tent to stay warm. 5 men in a tent for 3? There was no room for a stove in the cramped space. They had to eat only food that required no preparation. Frozen bars, crackers, anything they could stuff in their mouths. Lewis and Schiff grew very weak. Wilcox and Snyder began to lose feeling in their fingers and toes. Frostbite, the first stage. On July 23rd, the weather conditions improved slightly. The 5 men began their descent to the camp at 3,700 meters, slowly, carefully belaying one another. When the group of 5 reached base camp on July 25, the other 7 members of the expedition were likely already dead. Most likely, they had died back on July 18 or 19, during the first 24 hours of the storm. Mount Denali became the final resting place for Luchterhand, James, Walt Taylor, Steve Taylor, Russell, McLaughlin, and Clark. Of the 7, only 3 bodies were found. One climber was discovered in the high camp. He was sitting in his tent, his hands clutching a pole, apparently trying to keep the shelter from being destroyed by the wind. His hands were frozen in that position. He had obviously frozen to death in that pose. Alone, in a howling tent, holding the pole until his strength gave out. 2 others were found sitting on the slope, indicating an attempt to shelter from the wind. They were huddled together, trying to conserve heat. It didn't help. The bodies of the other 4 were never found. Experts speculated that they could have been scattered by the monstrously powerful wind, simply blown away like leaves. Or they fell into crevasses, or they remain under the snow, where no one will ever find them. We will never know exactly what happened on the mountain, but we can imagine. However, Snyder and Schlichter have a theory. After the signal from the summit, a monstrous storm hit the men, suddenly, like a hammer blow. Snyder puts it this way: these guys were still either on the very summit or on the summit ridge above 6,000 meters when the storm broke. Suddenly, the air became murky, visibility dropped to 0, and the wind kicked up immediately. Not gradually, instantly. You couldn't imagine a worse situation. In that kind of weather, the wind doesn't just rip gloves from your hands, it can even tear a backpack from your back. It can carry you away yourself. Trying to descend from the summit in such conditions is impossible. I think they started their descent and reached a point where it became every man for himself. The rope teams broke up. Everyone was trying to survive. 2 bodies were found on the slopes of Archdeacon's Tower. They were Walt Taylor and Dennis Luchterhand. Both were in good physical shape, quite healthy and strong. They had tried to descend directly from the tower down a steep 1,225-meter slope to the camp at 4,500 and died on the way. They didn't make it. Their strength ran out, or they fell, or they simply froze to death. Another body was found at the high camp. It was Russell. Snyder speculates that at some point during the ascent, the weakened team member turned back and descended to the high camp, where he was eventually caught by the storm. He made it to the tent, he got inside, and there he remained. Steve Taylor's ice axe and sleeping bag were found at the edge of the Harper Icefall, between the high camp and the camp at 4,500, near a crevasse in a snow bridge where there was a hole. Snyder says, "I assume he got to that spot, planted his ice axe, and wrapped his sleeping bag around it to signal us below at 4,500 meters. A marker, a sign that he was there. Then, trying to get back to the high camp or push on toward us, he fell into the crevasse. The bridge didn't hold." As for the others, no one will probably ever know what happened to them. The mountain took them and did not give them back. For years after the incident, there were heated debates about the causes of the tragedy. People criticized the National Park Service for combining two groups of strangers. Why? For what purpose? Just to check a box? The parents of the deceased claimed that a rescue operation could have been launched much earlier, and perhaps someone would have survived. If the helicopters had flown immediately, if they hadn't waited for the storm to subside. Of course, a storm of criticism fell upon Joe Wilcox, the expedition leader who summited himself and then descended, leaving his group behind. He was criticized for his inability to manage the expedition, his weak leadership qualities, and for summiting with the Colorado climbers instead of waiting to ascend with the members of his own group. You are the leader. Lead everyone, not just yourself. Others believed that if he had shown leadership and forced Steve Taylor and Russell to descend to a lower altitude because of their altitude sickness, the outcome would have been different. The weak must descend. That's the rule. No heroics. Wilcox blamed himself for what happened, for many years. It was only after studies by the National Weather Service were published, proving that surviving such a storm was simply impossible, that the criticism subsided somewhat. The numbers spoke for themselves. 480 kilometers per hour, minus 30 degrees, 0 visibility. No one survives in such conditions. Wilcox says, "There was nothing we could have done for those climbers who were up there. It certainly took me a long time and a lot of research to realize that. Although I knew these people and felt that they could and should have survived, I now have to admit, neither they nor probably anyone else could have survived in such a storm." And Schlichter says this, "The tragedy happened because those guys didn't take advantage of the good weather early in the day, and then everything went wrong. The main thing in the mountains is the weather. It doesn't matter how strong, experienced, or careful you are. If you find yourself in such circumstances, the result will be dire. The mountain doesn't forgive mistakes. Nothing any of us could have done would have changed the situation. When a storm of that magnitude hits you at 6,000 meters, it's over." The 1967 incident remains the deadliest disaster in the history of climbing on Denali. 7 people in one night, a record no one wants to break. Wilcox described the details of this story in his book, White Winds, America's Most Tragic Climb, published in 1981. He wrote it to make sense of it all, for himself, to understand where the mistake was, if anything could have been changed. If we analyze the causes of the tragedy, then, besides the weather, we should note the group's lack of cohesion and the absence of a leader. They could have all summited in one day. Not just 4 climbers, there could have been many more. The weakened members would have been left in camp, and they would have started the ascent. As a whole group, one team. Then the experienced climbers would have provided safety for the less experienced. They would have gone together. And when they descended to the camp, they would have jointly helped the weakened members down, and everyone would have survived. They would have made the ascent and hit the weather window. They would have had time. But what happened was this. The 4 most experienced climbers summited, achieved their goal, and began their descent. All the inexperienced climbers were left on the mountain and died, left without a leader, without those who knew what to do. Generally, the role of a leader is critically important, especially in the mountains. Wilcox, of course, could have talked them out of the ascent. He could have used his authority and forbidden the climb altogether. He was obligated to bring the members suffering from altitude sickness down to lower altitudes. This is not a request, it's a safety requirement. Why he didn't do it remains unclear. Maybe he didn't want conflict. Maybe he thought they could handle it. Maybe he himself didn't understand the scale of his responsibility. Moreover, he saw that the weather was starting to turn, yet he did nothing to stop the ascent, even though he had the opportunity. Cirrus clouds, strengthening wind. Everything pointed to an approaching storm, but he remained silent. I think he blames himself too, for years, but he tries to chalk it all up to the fact that it was impossible to survive in such a storm. And that's true. You couldn't survive in such a storm. However, they might not have had to face that storm. They could have left earlier. They could have all climbed together on the 15th. They could have not split up at all. But history has no what-ifs. What happened, happened. 7 people remained on Denali forever.